recording is in progress. And since it is recording, welcome everyone. This is the fourth meeting of the traditional Buddhist chanting class. And we spend 4 meetings on each of the chants that we're going to be discussing over the course of a year. And so this is our fourth and final meeting discussing Jijang Bosal chanting. And we're going to begin our class with the chanting the Great Dharani together. So I'm going to share the screen and mute everybody and play the recording of the Great Dharani. Okay, so there's actually some quite a few things that I want to cover tonight, and so I would like to just kind of jump in and actually for the first half of our class focus on kind of a just more of a presentation from me. Please, during which, please feel free to ask questions or make points if something comes up. Does anybody have like a pressing question or something? We will have ample time for discussion during the second half. So, okay, good. All right. Let's see. Make sure I don't too much junk on my screen. Here we go. share my screen. We are trying to get into slideshow. All right. So, yeah, so this is a slide that has already been seen in theory. I don't expect people to have perfect memory of everything that we've talked about in each class, but this is a slide about the overall structure of all of the Yambol chants, which includes Jijang Bosal chanting. The first part of each chant is the Namu part, or the homage part, or the refuge part, or the invocation part. You can call it any of these. In the Jijang Bosal chant, it's where we say Namu, Nambang Huaju, Jijang Bosal, etc. Uh, in the Kwanzaa Bosal chant, it's where you say, what is it? Namu, Namu. No, you know what it is, Joe. Now I'm blanking on it.
For the first three.
Yeah, well, just it's homage to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha in
Yeah,
Sino-Korean. Yeah, okay. So that's
yeah,
the first part. Then right after that, each of the Yumbo chants is dedicated to a particular Buddha or Bodhisattva, and that this is the part of the chant, the second part in this structure, where we recite the name of that Buddha or Bodhisattva over and over again.
yeah.
Then this is where we're at now. We're talking about the 5 mantras. And so this part, the third part, is actually broken up into 5 parts. And then at the very end, there's a little verse from the very, very end of the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is a verse in praise of the Buddha. All right. So where we're at now, and I'm going to fast forward up here. Now, where we're at now is talking about the 5 mantras. We've talked about the first mantra in Jijang Bosal chanting a little bit, the Myor Jongop Darani, or the Myor Upjang Darani, sometimes it's called. Either way, it's okay. Actually, most people that I know and I myself say Myor Upjang Darani, even though that's probably not right. The second mantra I'm going to skip over for now. This mantra is also part of Kwanzaa Bosal chanting, which we will be discussing later on in this class. And I want to jump to the third mantra, which is like the first one in Jijang Bosal chanting. The first and third mantras in Jijang Bosal chanting are also called Dharanis. So this is the Boso Soje Gelsang Dharani. So and then the fourth and fifth mantras are both very good, very important, very useful mantras. Actually, you can use these mantras for any kind of chanting or recitation practice. It's always a good idea if you're doing sutra recitation or any kind of chanting practice, when you're done, to recite the mantra for correcting mistakes. And then it's very important to recite the mantra for dedication of merit. And these will also be talked about later on in the class when we talk about Kwanzaa Bosal chanting, because they're in that as well. And we will also talk about the closing praise of Shakyamuni Buddha and other things that are involved in Kwanzaa Bosal chanting. Okay, so now we have already talked about Jijang's Dharani for eliminating fixed karma. Here's another title for it: the mantra for eradicating deep-seated karma. There's lots of ways of expressing this in English. The point of this slide is to show that up at the top are the Chinese characters for the for the for the actual Dharani itself, along with the pronunciation in Mandarin on the second line, Vietnamese on the third line, the Korean pronunciation on the fourth line. This is in Romanized. This is sounding out the Sanskrit using letters that we can that we understand. And this is writing Sanskrit in Devanagari, which is one of the native scripts that Sanskrit is written in. This is a more accurate way of writing out Sanskrit. The point here is just that everybody is chanting the same thing, but pronouncing it differently. And by same thing, I mean these, when the chant was transmitted from India to China, it was written down. The Sanskrit sounds were written down using these characters. And as Chinese Buddhism spread throughout East Asia, different people had different places in East Asia have different ways of pronouncing the characters. Now this slide is it kind of gets across an important point. This everything that's colored on the left side of the slide is places where people use Chinese characters, where people study the Chinese language as part of their formal education, and where at some point in history, Chinese has been used as basically the official language for the government and for higher education. Now, in places like Vietnam and in Korea, it's no longer the case that Chinese is used nearly as much as it was at one time. In Japan, Chinese characters are hard baked into the language now. They're part of the writing system of Japanese. So every Japanese school child has to learn kanji, much to their regret, I would imagine. And then anyway, so any part of this map that's colored, there has been some strong historical influence of Chinese language and Chinese characters, including, of course, China. Here's Mongolia. Mongolia at one time uh, had China as the official language for government and for higher education. Um, the Mongolian Buddhists now do most of their practices in Tibetan because they are Tibetan Buddhists or Vajrayana Buddhists. Anyway, so in this map shows a similar thing for Sanskrit. This shows the extent to which the Sanskrit language. So the main thing to get included in this map, a place, a country, or region has to have a lot of um, uh, inscriptions written in Sanskrit. And these inscriptions are often in the Devanagari script that I showed on a previous slide. A lot of times they're in Siddham script, which is a different way of writing Sanskrit. But either in Siddham or Devanagari or some other script that is not Chinese characters and not from this part of Asia, but from this part of Asia in here. Indic scripts. There's a bunch of different writing systems that came out of India. Some of which were for writing Sanskrit, some of which were for writing Pali or other languages. But all of these parts of Asia are places where you find inscriptions. That is things. An inscription basically means things that are literally written in stone, so that they stay around for a long time. But these are also places where at some point Sanskrit was heavily studied and was even used, very likely, as a language for trade and even government and diplomacy. And this area here is sometimes called the Sanskrit Cosmopolis or the Indosphere. And of course, you see that there is a huge area where they overlap. And so the reason why these two maps are kind of interesting is because chanting Sanskrit mantras written out in Chinese characters is to some extent makes sense when you look at this map. When you look at the extent of Sanskrit spreading over Asia and you look at the extent of Chinese characters spreading over Asia, the places where these two colored areas overlap is largely where you will find Buddhist mantras written in Chinese characters. So here's a different example of this phenomenon of everybody chanting the same thing, only saying it differently. This is the Heart Sutra mantra.
Right.
What the pronunciations of the Heart Sutra mantra vary quite a bit from one place to another in Asia. And I won't go through all this, not time. So Mandarin, Vietnamese, Japanese, Korean, and then 3 different ways of writing out the Sanskrit mantra down here. And of course, not only the Sanskrit, not only the Heart Sutra mantra, but the title of the Heart Sutra and the entire body of the Heart Sutra, of course, is pronounced differently depending upon if you are a speaker of Mandarin or Vietnamese or Japanese or Korean. And then, of course, these are all different from the Sanskrit of the, even though they're all in some sense approximations of the Sanskrit. And let's see, this bell here, this is a bell from a temple in Korea, and it has Sanskrit inscriptions on it written in Siddham script, which I'll talk about Siddham a little bit later on. It's like if if you know what Devanagari is, which is the way you usually see Sanskrit written out these days, but at one point, especially in East Asia, Siddham was very popular, and it's still used quite a bit in East Asia to some extent. Anyway, and this is from the Great Dharani. And this just has some Siddham on. This is actually from this is 2 different. These are pages from 2 different chanting books in Korea. Chanting books for the Great Dharani, and what each of them shows is actually this one over here has the romanization as well, but it has the Hangul and the Siddham. This one doesn't have the romanization, but it does have the Siddham, the Devanagari, and the Hangul for a small portion of the Great Dharani. All right, so now we're going to talk about the next Dharani. So we're skipping over the second of the 5 mantras and going to the long one, basically. This is the long Dharani that is in both Jijang Bosal chanting and Kwanzaa Bosal chanting, the Bulso Soje Gilsang Darani. And one of the patterns for these 5 mantras is that in the chant, you go through each mantra and you first say the title of the mantra, which in this case is the Bulso Soje Gilsang Darani, and then you recite the mantra itself. It'll be a couple of slides before we get to the actual pronunciation of the mantra itself. I want to spend some time talking about the Dharani. Well, let's first of all just say that this Dharani is not just part of Kwanzaa Bosal chanting and Jijang Bosal chanting, which come from the Korean Buddhist tradition. This Dharani is chanted in Soto Zen temples, Rinzai Zen temples, and generally speaking, all Japanese Buddhists, including non-Zen people, recite this Dharani. So that's Japan. It's also extremely popular in China and Vietnam as well. Why? Well, look at the title. This is the mantra for averting disasters and bringing good fortune. And and it's a little longer. It has kind of a little bit more mystique to it, I would say. Also this one is well attested in the Tibetan tradition as well. It's slightly different. For the most part, the Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese versions are all they're all very, very, very close to being the same. The only time you find a difference is when sometimes the Vietnamese will use a particular character, sometimes the Chinese will use a different character, sometimes the Japanese prefer. There are some substitutions in the characters that you'll find. And it becomes even a little bit more complicated if you add in people who use the simplified Chinese characters. There's a a group of students of Zen Master Sung San in Singapore that have their own chanting book that you can find online. Um,
Oh,
and they have all the chants written out in simplified Chinese characters. It's actually, and I'll explain this a little bit later on. The Great Dharani, which we will be talking, we'll spend a whole 2 months talking about the Great Dharani later on. But as a general rule, um, Korean Buddhists don't write out the Great Dharani using Chinese characters. They always either use Hangul, they sound it out in the Hangul script, which is the native script of Korean, or they write it in Siddham,
hmm,
in the Siddham script. The one exception to that is this group in Singapore, which is a
hmm,
group of students of Zen Master Sung San, and they write the Great Dharani out using simplified Chinese characters, and it's really crazy if you're familiar with the traditional Chinese characters. Anyway, it blew my mind when I found it as I tried to go through their transliteration of the Great Dharani using the simplified Chinese characters. But um, sometimes my mind is too easily blown or is too easily amused. Right. All right. Now, um, oh, so this Dharani, which is also called the wondrous Dharani for averting calamities. Um, I'm gonna put this. Oh yeah, here's some Siddham over here, by the way. Um, there's some people. Now, when I first learned the Great Dharani, for example, I was told that there was no translation of it and that it couldn't be translated. Uh, and and that's actually what Zen Master Sung San told people. And so all the people who were trained by him, that's what they told people, and that's what people are still telling people. Now, it's not true. I mean, there's some. Well, you could say the same thing for the Heart Sutra. I mean, if you look at a translation of the Heart Sutra, uh, just having the Heart Sutra translated into English isn't the meaning of the Heart Sutra. Okay, it's kind of comforting to our to our psyches to have it translated into English so that we have some sense of what it means. But just having an English translation of the Heart Sutra is very far from having a true grasp of the meaning of the Heart Sutra. And in fact, if you want to know the meaning of the Heart Sutra, you've got to study the Chinese and the Sanskrit of it. Um, Even if you have an English translation of it, you can't really study the Heart Sutra by studying the various English translations of it. Um, but uh, my point here is just that there's a certain amount of truth to saying that, oh, you can't really, convey the meaning of the Great Dharani or any Dharani. I mean, and that's all translations are at best approximations. But in fact, there are many translations of the wondrous Dharani for averting calamities. The first, and I'll show several of them um, in a little bit. So if you encounter this anywhere, including from people who've been trained by Zen Master Sung San, it's always, depending upon how, so some people will say, oh yes, this chant or this Dharani or whatever is very, you know, mysterious and profound, and it just cannot be translated. So if someone says something like that, you should be polite, in my opinion. You should not. It's not important to argue with people over things like this, but you might just point out to them that if they go to Google, they could find translations of many Dharanis, including the Great Dharani and the Wondrous Dharani for averting calamities. That there are translations of them, and these translations are actually fairly accurate. Um, and based on the original Sanskrit. Um, on the other hand, there are some people who say, "Oh, Dharanis are just meaningless gobbledygook." Those people you can be less polite with, and you can say, "These Dharanis are wonderful practices, and they're profoundly meaningful." And if you are too ignorant about that, if you are too close-minded about that, uh, even in this case, it's still best not to argue and name call, even though I just did a little bit right there. But um, you can say, "Oh yes, there's meaning there. There's tremendous meaning there." And if you just do a little googling, you can find the meaning too. Okay. So another thing that throws people off a little bit is when these Dharanis or mantras are written out in Chinese characters, because the characters then are not used. The characters do have meaning, right? But when a mantra or a Dharani is written out in Chinese characters, the characters are just being used for their sound value, for their phonetic value. Um, and then some people will point to the fact that the characters are, in a certain literal sense, meaningless here because they're just used for their sounds. But that's not. Uh, that just means that a person doesn't understand how transliteration works. In order for us to practice any of these mantras or dharanis, we have to write them out in letters that we understand, and we approximate the sounds. Okay, so but actually, a more accurate way that is still quite prevalent in East Asia is to write out mantras and dharanis using uh, uh, oh yeah, well, so there's no, yeah, using the Siddham script. Okay, and this is a more accurate way of writing a mantra and dharani, of representing the Siddham, the Sanskrit sounds. Unfortunately, outside of people who are really experts and specialists, nobody really understands Siddham. And especially in the Korean tradition, the Koreans use their own kind of somewhat idiosyncratic version of Siddham. Um, but if you ever want to know about Siddham, go to the visiblemantra.org website. There's a link right here. You'll learn. So there's a book called Visible Mantra, and there's a website called Visible Mantra, and there's another book by John Stevens, I think is his name, called Sacred Calligraphy of the East, and he has a big section of that book on Siddham. Let's see. All right. Okay. So now to the translations. All right. So this is a translation by D.T. Suzuki. Um, and for again, for people who say, "Oh, you can't translate the Great Dharani," um, this translation is in the same book as D.T. Suzuki's translation of the Great Dharani, and it was published in 1934. So there's been an English translation of the Great Dharani since 1934, and this book is one of the most popular and widely read books on Zen ever in Western society. Um, and so there's really little or no justification for anybody saying that Dharanis, including the Great Dharani, cannot be translated. They have been translated. And D.T. Suzuki's translation, one could say the translations are not very good, and I would say that that's probably true of this translation of D.T. Suzuki's translation of the of this particular the disaster averting Dharani, and his translation of the Great Dharani is not very good either. But it's actually considered to be a good starting point. So everybody who's made better translations since D.T. Suzuki has used his translation as a starting point. And it's very helpful for someone to go first and make lots of mistakes, even though everyone else says, oh, well, that wasn't a very good, but it was a good first try, I would say. Adoration to all the Buddhas, adoration to the teaching that knows no obstructions. Thus, Om Kya Kya Kyahi Kyahi, speak, speak. Hum hum. So notice he doesn't translate hum, he doesn't translate hum. Jwala jwala, prajwala prajwala, blaze blaze. Tishta tishta, up up. Sri sri, question mark. Spata spata, burst burst. One who is quiescent, to the glorious one. Hail. All right, so that's D.T. Suzuki's translation of the disaster averting Dharani. Um, in the same book that he provides that translation, D.T. Suzuki insists famously that, here is a famous quote, properly speaking, the Dharani, that is, reciting of Dharanis in general, has no legitimate place in Zen. Despite saying this, he included a chapter on Dharanis in his book on how to practice Zen. And he gives, I'm going to skip over this now. I don't want to get engaged too much of an argumentation with D.T. Suzuki or people who still believe the things that he said. But he tries to provide a justification, but he's basically trying to have it both ways. He says, "Oh, properly. The key word here is properly speaking." So what DT Suzuki is saying is that uh, all Japanese Zen Buddhists recite Dharanis, but really they shouldn't. And so, uh, yeah, all right. And so here's a bunch of here's one by Shindo Gensho. Here's one from a website that doesn't provide the name of the translation. Here's one from Kaz Tanahashi.
Oh,
Um, Here's one from Sakurai, which he did this in collaboration with Jan Chosen Bays. And I think they had a little help from Joan Halifax as well.
right,
Um, uh, Sakurai Shuyu and Kamata Shigeo, two Japanese scholars. This is one I found on the website of the Pacific Zen Institute. Um, I don't know if they gave a name for who did this translation or not, but it's on their website. Um, so uh, just because this chant is so popular, so in Korean Buddhism, we recite this Dharani as part of Kwanzaa Bosal chanting and Jijang Bosal chanting primarily. In other schools of Buddhism, it's chanted not all, usually not on its own, although people do that. People will sit and just recite this Dharani as a meditation practice, including Korean Buddhists will as well. But usually it's part of uh, a longer liturgy or list of so in Chinese and Vietnamese Buddhism, they have a practice that's called the 10 small mantras. And this is the second of the 10 small mantras that they recite as part of their, and often the 10 small mantras is preceded by, uh, I think it, you do the Heart Sutra, and then you do the 10 small mantras, and then you do the Great Dharani. Great Dharani is also very, very popular in Korea, I mean, in China and Vietnam. All right. So here is the Dharani. And this is good because we've only got like 2 minutes before we go to a break. Um, Also Soji Gilsang Darani. So when you recite the Dharani or any mantra, it's always good to recite the title of the mantra Dharani first, or just recite it one time. And then Namu Samanda Motanam Abaraji Harasa Sananam Danyata Om Kakakai Kai Hom Hom Abara Abara Bara Abara Bara Abara Jita Jita Jiri Jiri Bara Bara Sanjiga Shirie Saba. And then when we do this as part of Jijang Bosal chanting or Kwanzaa Bosal chanting, we do the whole Dharani 3 times.
right,
And then people will often do it 108 times, 100 or 1,000 times or whatever. And I've got actually I have a bunch of links that I'm going to share to YouTube recordings of people reciting this Dharani,
good.
some of whom are doing it for many times. Anyway, let's.
Mm,
So this is, and here it's written out in the Chinese characters on the first line, the Hangul script on the second line, and then the romanization spelled out so that we can make the sounds on the third line. This is a little different from what you usually see in chanting books. I've taken out the dashes. The dashes. I try to figure out what the rhyme or reason is of the dashes that one often finds in these chanting transliterations. Um, uh, so I took out the dashes, and I changed so the some of the vowels are not accurately represented in the chanting books that you'll normally see if you download one from the internet or at your local Zen center. Probably has a slightly different transliteration with Dharanis with dashes in kind of random places, and with some of the vowels, especially the O's and the U's, not always represented accurately. Although also the double consonants, the Korean double consonants, which drive everybody crazy who tries to learn any Korean, are also usually not accurately represented um, in those. But this is just uh, trying to write. I'm trying to, and basically, I'm just trying to follow the what's called the revised Romanization, the RR. Okay, so now it is 7:36. So we should take a 5-minute break, okay? And then come back and we can take questions. I've got some more stuff that I can go over, but I've been talking for half an hour straight, so I would love to hear someone else's voice when we get back from break and have some more back and forth. Okay.
Great.
So, are there questions, comments at this point?
I have a comment.
Okay.
Hey, it's just I also came along with the similar people telling me, oh, well, these don't mean anything. It's just gibberish. And it's interesting
Yeah.
because also just over the years, I've been able just to, with various words, just to point out, say, oh, well, I know that means this or that, or,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
so I guess I'm just trying to think like why people are saying that. Is it
Hmm.
easier just to ignore
Oh.
that, you know, skirt around it?
Hmm.
Because it's once you get into translating it, it's big involved
Yeah.
stuff.
Um, I don't know why. Uh, I could speculate, but I mean, I have like, I was always told that the Great Dharani cannot be translated, and it
Right.
doesn't have any meaning. The word it doesn't.
Yep.
They aren't words or whatever. And I always told people that.
Yep.
And then one day, I was sitting in my living room, uh, at the place that we lived at before we moved here. But this was like 23 years ago. We chanted the Great Dharani, and there was a very bright Indian guy who was practicing with our group at the time, and he said, "Oh, no, I can understand part of this," because
Right.
he know well. So Hindi and Sanskrit are kind of related to each other, but he
Yep.
also knew some Sanskrit, and so he could pick out parts of the Great Dharani and say, "This is such and such," and I said, "Really?"
Right.
And uh, yeah, so that ended my telling people that it doesn't mean anything.
All right.
And
All
then
right.
I found
Wait.
D.T. Suzuki's translation, and then I found out that there's a whole book written on the Great Dharani by a great Sanskrit scholar named Lokesh Chandra, which has multiple translations and versions of the. Anyway, so yeah. Um,
Or people are wanting to make them seem more mysterious or
well,
more like incantations and
right.
magic.
So sometimes people don't want to translate it because because that would be disrespectful or because that would take some of the mystery out of it or whatever. Other times people say it's meaningless for the opposite reason because they want to say it's just gibberish. Um, so it works both ways. Neither is really true. Do you want to say anything, Elizabeth or Lauren? I've got more PowerPoint slides if you can contain your excitement, but it's not an idle threat. I really do. All right. So, uh, here we go. Now, uh, so I mentioned Kaz Tanahashi. He has a kind of a nice little book called Zen Chants: 35 Essential Texts with Commentary. The only part of that book that I really looked at closely so far is the part that he has on this particular Dharani, which he calls the Wondrous Dharani for Averting Calamities. I like that particular title. It has a lot. Once you translate it into English, there's lots of different ways of translating it. Um, but I'm going to skip over this because I want to get to this is good information. He provides some good information on the background information on the Dharani, as well as
Hmm.
his own translation that he did with Jan Chosen Bays. And okay, I want to talk about the backstory of the Dharani. So uh, Kaz Tanahashi, in his description of the Dharani, tells us that it comes from a particular sutra, but he doesn't really tell us anything about what it says in the sutra, other than it gives the Dharani. Now, this particular sutra is very short, but it's also very weird and interesting. So the sutra, not unlike the Garbha Sutra, is not taught on earth. But unlike the Kshitigarbha Sutra, which is taught in the Triastrimsis heaven, all right, so the backstory is the wonders around it. According to the Sutra on the Dharani of glaring light, great awesome merit of the Tathagata dissolving all calamities. That's a very kind of mouthful, awkward, kind of a word for word, character by character translation of the Chinese title of the sutra. Um, what's going on in the sutra? It was taught by the Buddha in the pure abodes. Now, according to Buddhist cosmology, there are 31 planes or phases of existence. We live in one of the, if you haven't noticed, we live in one of the lower planes of existence. Okay, I notice it all the time. Most of us do. Now, two planes above us is this very nice heavenly realm called Tushita heaven, and I mean Triastrimsis heaven, which is where the Buddha's is where the Buddha taught the the Kshitigarbha Sutra, the Jijang Bosal Sutra. It's also where he delivered a number of teachings, many of which are collected in what's known as the Abhidharma, um, which is which is the third basket of the Tripitaka. Um, two levels above Triastrimsis heaven is Tushita heaven, which is where Maitreya Buddha is practicing, awaiting his turn to be the next Buddha here in Jambudvipa. 13 levels above Tushita heaven is the pure abodes, and there's actually 5 abodes. So the lowest of the 5 pure abodes is 13 levels above Tushita heaven. And so, uh, uh, and this is a quote from the sutra. The Buddha said to the wandering celestial beings in the heavens, including devas associated with the 9 mutually attracted celestial bodies, devas associated with the 28 constellation spirits of the 12 palaces of the zodiac, and the multitude of sages. So, and there's a link to where the sutra is not very long, but except for this one passage here and the Dharani itself, the rest of it has not been translated into English that I know of. And I've looked, and I've kind of looked through it myself, even though it's not very long. It's kind of bizarre. It's a strange little story. Anyway, so one question is, why did the Buddha go up into this heavenly realm and teach this particular very short sutra with a nice Dharani embedded in it to these heavenly beings? Well, the people who live, or the beings who live up there, are the non-returners. And so this is a concept that goes back to Theravada Buddhism. One of the attainments, one of the levels of attainment that you could reach, or that you can reach, according to Theravada Buddhism, is you can get up to the level where you are not an arhat yet, but you will never be reborn as a human or in any of the lower realms again. You will only be reborn one more time up in these very high pure abodes, where you will continue to practice until you become an arhat. Now, that's the concept in Theravada Buddhism. In Mahayana Buddhism, these non-returners are actually seen as very high-level bodhisattvas who have basically 2 jobs. One is to come down, send out emanations of themselves down here to Jambudvipa to help us out, to help us to avert disasters and to receive good fortune. Their other job is to kind of control the astrological forces, the planets, the constellations, the sun, the moon, Rahu, Ketu, all these things. If you have any familiarity with the Indian So Indian astrology is a little different from Western astrology, if you have any familiarity with either one. Um, and Buddhist astrology is um, very well, is a branch basically of Indian astrology. If you're into astrology, it's not really a question of having having to believe in things like astrology. The idea is that these are beings, very powerful, very advanced beings who are helping to maintain the equilibrium of the universe, um, to help to avoid calamities. Sometimes it seems like they're not doing a very good job down here on Jamba Vipa, but that brings us to how these two parts of their job um, kind of connect, and how they're related to this Dharani. So the Buddha taught them this Dharani to help them in their job, for them to practice this Dharani to help them to maintain the cosmic balance, um, but also so that they would recognize it when they come down to Jambudvipa. If somebody is chanting this Dharani, they recognize it, they know it, so they will help you. It's kind of it's a signal, I guess, or a code
Hmm.
word or whatever. It's one way of looking at it. Yeah. So that's the backstory. That's where this Dharani comes from. Um, Now, other explanations for the Dharani, Zen Master Sungsan never talked about the pure abodes, or of course he would say you couldn't translate this Dharani anyway, but he did give kind of little descriptions for different mantras and Dharanis. And he said for this Dharani, this is for those with heavy karma. This mantra will take away all good and bad and all opposites, and then cutting through your heavy karma will become easy.
Hmm.
Now, a teacher who's associated with the Sunnyvale, isn't that where Buffy the Vampire Slayer took place, in Sunnyvale, California, I think? But it's a real place, just like Springfield, you know. Master Wu Chui of the Chung Tai Zen Temple of Sunnyvale, which I don't know anything about this temple, but I do know that they have a website. And on this website, they discuss this Dharani, or at least this teacher discusses the Dharani, and he gives a very nice description of what this Dharani is really about. He said, misfortune is derived from the mind and is extinguished by the mind. And all so-called misfortunes are sufferings from retribution caused by past negative karmas. When karmic obstacles are cleared, the mind is relieved and realizes blessings. When one is deluded, blessings may be perceived as misfortune. When one is enlightened, misfortune may be perceived as blessings. So, at least to my mind, this is just a little bit more spelled out version of what Zen Master Sung San is saying up here. Um, uh, it takes away all opposites, taking away all opposites. But at the same time, you could just think of this Dharani as very much like the Parita chanting of Theravada Buddhism, which, if you know, Theravada Buddhists do a lot of chanting, and a lot of their chanting it's in Pali. So one interesting thing about Pali is that's a language that nobody speaks. um, but all Theravada Buddhists do their chanting in Pali, and uh, a lot of that chanting is what they call Parita chanting. And if you ask them what is Parita chanting, it's chanting for um, protection and blessings. And that's what this Dharani is. It's a chanting for protection from calamities and for blessings, for good fortune. Um, and so this is so in that sense, this is just a very standard type of chant. Also, the Parita chants that are done in Theravada Buddhism are all chants that were taught by the Buddha himself. They are the words of the Buddha. And this Dharani, one of the things that's, let me go back a little bit just to emphasize this. This Dharani, the first two uh, characters of the title of this Dharani are Buddha spoken. And so this Dharani really heavily emphasizes the fact that this Dharani was taught by the Buddha, that these are the words of the Buddha that we are reciting when we chant this Dharani. And that's also a characteristic of Parita chanting in Theravada Buddhism. And so let's see, one more. Here's okay. So here's the entire text of the sutra in Chinese that the Dharani comes from. And right here, this part in here, whoops. See, I always get mixed up how to do things in PowerPoint. This middle part in here, this is the Dharani itself with a lot of very confusing little notations in Chinese, of course. Some of which are kind of like line numbers, some of which tell you which tone to chant the character, the sound of the character in, and others of which I cannot, haven't figured out how to decipher yet. Um, but anyway, so this is a very, 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 very short sutra as sutras go. And most of it is just like, it's basically a sandwich. It has a beginning, it has an end, and the meat of the sandwich is the Dharani that is being taught by the Buddha in this sutra. Let's see, what else is there? Okay, yeah. So this Dharani is really popular throughout Asia. And let's see, okay. And I've got a list of 21 YouTube videos of people chanting this Dharani. And they're in a blog post that I have, which is actually about this Dharani in Kwanzaa Bosal chanting. So I have a series of blog posts on my blog at mindisbuddha.org about Kwanzaa Bosal chanting. And I've got 21 links to 21 videos. 5 are people chanting using the Korean pronunciation. 4 are people using the Sino-Japanese pronunciation. 2 are people using. I used to have 3 from the Vietnamese, but you know when you have lots of links to YouTube videos, they're constantly breaking, or people take the videos down, or whatever. And 10 of them are from China. 10 of them are although of the 10 from China, one of them is by Amy Oi. Anybody here familiar with Amy Oi? So she's a really, really popular Buddhist uh, musician. She does musical recordings of mantras and Dharanis and chants. And so her chant. So she's Chinese. I think she's ethnically Chinese, but I think she's from Malaysia. I'm probably wrong about that, but um, her recording of this is actually her reconstruction of the Sanskrit version of the mantra. But I include it with the Chinese ones because the rest of the video is all in Chinese. And then I've also got 6 different YouTube recordings of the previous Dharani that we did, which is Jijang Bosal's Dharani for eliminating fixed karma, which is also extremely popular. Um, for the same reason, because people think it's good. It will help them. And the first 4 are all in Chinese versions, and the second 2 are Korean versions. Okay, so those are the kind of going through it very quickly. All the slides I have, all the presentation that I have, and so we've got a few minutes. We're going to do the actual chant, the Jijang Bosal chant at the end. But love to hear from either Lauren or Elizabeth or even Joe. But I mean, Joe is very talkative. Any questions or comments or uh, you can't you anyway. You should still have questions about Jijang Bosal chanting and the disaster prevention Dharani, because it's not that easy to understand. At least I don't think. What do you think, Elizabeth? Oh, she won't go for it. Okay. Let's see. Uh, So one thing that's kind of fun, I think. Let's see if I can get to it. Oh yeah. I'm gonna share my screen, and I think I'm not sharing my screen. I'm going to share my screen and look at some of these different videos of people chanting this Dharani. Here we go. Oh yeah. So, okay, this is my favorite version of Dharani with the Japanese pronunciation. You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, so here it is. This is from a CD.
Shōsai Myōkichijō Darani. No Sambanda Motora no Harashi Kotosha Sonora Toshi Toen Gya 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 Ki Gya Ki Unru Shifura Shifura Hara Shifura Hara Shifura Chishusa Chishusa Chishuri Chishuri Sohaja Sohaja Senchi Gya Shirie Somoko Nomo Sambanda Motona Nohara Shikotosha Sonona Tochi Toen Gya 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 Ki Gya Ki Unnu Shifura Shifura Hara Shifura Hara Shifura Chishusa Chishusa Chishuri Chishuri Sohaja Sohaja Senchi Gya Shirie Somo.
Okay, that's pretty good. Let's see.
Or is that typical that the chanting speeds up?
You know, I don't. People do chanting differently. And okay, you want to talk about? Let's see. Here's
Like
this one. Oh yeah. Here,
Tonight's Dharani is
first-
here for
first
all
we have
of
to watch
life's
the commercial.
what-ifs. Like, what
30
if you
seconds.
need urgent care?
So here's one with drums. Okay. But the speeding up is not necessarily typical. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Okay, I'm going to stop that there, just because we're running out of time a little bit. But so varying the speed of chanting is something that people have been playing with in Buddhism for centuries, and so doing it fast, doing it slow. So some people like to do it fast. Some people always chant fast. Some people always chant slow. A lot of people like to vary the speed, and that's usually up to the group of people that's doing it or who's leading the chanting. You know, basically, if there's one person with the moktak, you have to go along with, and if they're speeding it up or slowing it down or whatever, you go along with them. But actually, people have developed very elaborate theories about doing chanting at different speeds, and then you combine. So there's different things that you can do to I don't know that to jazz it up, I guess. I don't know how else to put it. Because you can,
Absolutely.
but people also walk around while they chant. So you walk around, and then sometimes people will walk around in a circle. Sometimes people will do like snake type dances, do like spiral dances where everybody spirals in and then you spiral out. Um, and then also people do. There are often mudras that you can do along with, especially with mantras. Um, there are visualizations that people do. So there's lots of things. I mean, jazzing it up is not really necessarily the correct Sanskrit term for what's going on there, but um, these are mindfulness practices really, and they're there to help you um, to focus uh, different aspects of your mind and your body, on the practice. Uh,
With
yeah.
a group, it seems like an energy practice too. Is keto? What was the name of?
So keto, and so sometimes keto, sometimes people translate keto as energy way, but that's actually not true. The word keto actually means to pray.
Hmm.
So keto practice is praying. Um, it's a kind of the characters for ki and do uh, sound the same as the characters for energy and Tao. It can be mistranslated as energy way, but that's based upon a misunderstanding of the pronunciation. The same two characters, they're also pronounced ki and do, both mean pray. So it's just praying. Um, and it's found in Japanese Buddhism as well, where it's just called kito. Um, but it is energetic. It's very energetic, and varying the speed is kind of a way of playing with that energy. Uh, and one of the ways so one of the things that's happening when people vary the speed is that it further increases the sense of group together action, you know, because you have to follow the leader. And if you're walking in line and everybody is snaking around and the chanting is going fast and then slow, also people will vary the volume, very soft, very loud. And if you're doing all that, uh, you can you can just say it makes you pay attention more. But some people think that there are, that if you get it just right, that there's some just like some people say Dharanis are meaningless, but they're not really. All these different tricks that you can do, fast, slow, loud, soft, walking around different ways, um, or doing different mudras, hand gestures. Uh, a lot of people think that that really does manipulate energy in a way that's beneficial, to your practice.
And there is the difference between doing it in a group and doing it by yourself.
Yeah.
The chanting by yourself. So
Yeah.
Interesting.
And so if you're doing it by yourself, then you can do it however you want, right? You could do it really fast if you're in a hurry. You could do it really slow if you think, or it's like if it's, if you think that's good. But I usually do, unfortunately. I mean, I'll make a confession. I usually do it really fast because I'm often keeping track of, number of repetitions. Um, but Zen Master Sung San also encouraged people to do mantras fast. He said that was a good way to clean your mind. Then the mantra goes around very fast, like a washing machine, and then the mind is in the center of the washing machine, and it becomes very still. Um, and he would actually encourage people to memorize the Great Dharani and to do it over and over again as fast as they can, which I've never. I mean, I find that very challenging, personally. Okay. Um, are there other questions before we go on to just to close it with the Jijang Bosal chanting? Questions or comments?
All very interesting.
Yeah, there were a lot more that I could have shared. Let's see. So I've got a bunch of, maybe, let me just, let's see, where's one? Yeah. It's traditional song. I'm just going to play this.
Cut the cable with Fios Home Internet and cut your internet bill to just $25 a month.
I finally cut the cable, switched.
불설수지길상 다라니 범삼만다 무타남 하바라지야다 서서나나 단야타 옴가가가예 가예 우무마바라 아바라바라 지타지타 지리지리 바다바다 선지가 지리에 사바나.
Okay, that was one repetition. So just to give the Korean version, that guy has a lot of, he's kind of a YouTube chanting star of some, a lot of, you find Korean traditional chants on YouTube, they're often by, I recognize the voice, I don't know who he is.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Now,
Kurt, will this page of your blog be available?
yeah, it's available. It's always available if you can find it. And when I post this YouTube video, there'll be a link to it in the description. There'll also be a link to it. There is a link to it in the PowerPoint slides. And I'll put a link to it in the email when I send out the email telling everybody, hey, I posted the YouTube video.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And now we will, let's see, do I have it here? Here somewhere. Oh yeah. I have, which folder do I have it in? Yes. And here it is. I found it, and now I'm going to share my screen again. And
what? You don't have.
Jijang Bosal, 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 Jijang Bosal. Myorok chanting Darani, Om Bharamani Dani Sabaha, Om Bharamani Dani Sabaha, Om Bharamani Dani Sabaha, Om Misfortune-Dispelling, Om Amoka, Salvadara Sadaya, Shive Hom, Om Amoka, Salvadara Sadaya, Shive Hom, Om Amoka, Salvadara Sadaya, Shive Hom, Shōsai Myōkichijō Darani, Nam Samanda Motanam, Abaraji Harasa, Sananam Danyata, Om Kaka Kai Kai Hom Hom Avara, Avara 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 Avara, Jitta Jitta Jiri Jiri Pada Pada Sanjiga, Shiriye Sabaha, Namu Samanda Motanam, Abaraji Harasa, Sananam Danyata, Om Kaka Kai Kai Hum Hum Abara, Abara 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 Abara, Jitta Jitta Jiri Jiri Pada Pada Sanjiga, Shiriye Sabaha, Namu Samanda Motanam, Abaraji Harasa, Sananam Danyata, Om Kaka Kai Kai Hum Hum Abara, Abara 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 Abara, Jitta Jitta Jiri Jiri Pada Pada Sanjiga, Shiriye Sabaha, Homage, Om Horo Horo Saya Roke Sabaha, Om Horo Horo Saya Roke Sabaha, Om Horo Horo Saya Roke Sabaha, Bonyang Jinon Om Samara Samara Mimara, Charma Jagora Barahom, Om Samara Samara Mimara, Charma Jagora Barahom, Om Samara Samara Mimara, Charma Jagora Barahom, Chakshil Shunyon Gasuji, Dehe Jungsu Kahonjin, Ogongayang Bungaye, Monong Jinsol,
thanks everybody for coming. Been great
Thank
to
you.
see you.
Thank you.
Although I did most of the talking this time, but still, it was great to see everybody here. And in 2 weeks, we will start our discussion of Homage to the Three Jewels, which is also a really cool chant. And we'll have a lot to talk about then. Okay?
Great.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.